To understand the events of the Rwandan Civil War and the genocide that followed, you must first learn a bit of history. There were two ethnicities in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Before Rwanda was colonized, there wasn't any systematic violence between the Tutsis and the Hutus. Interaction was allowed between them. However, everything changed when Europeans first arrived with the intention of colonizing Rwanda. In the 1800s, when the Germans invaded Rwanda, they favored the Tutsis. The Germans brought the racial theory that Tutsis were the natural rulers of Rwanda. The Belgians who invaded after World War I ended put this into practice by establishing a Tutsi king and nobility. The Belgians also made several changes to the way things were run. In schools, it was taught that the Tutsis were racially superior to the Hutus to explain the reasoning behind why a Tutsi was the leader. Tutsis were given better jobs and had authoritative positions. Also, in 1933, the Belgians made it mandatory for everyone in the country to have an identity card. These identity cards were marked with a stamp to show which group you belonged to. You were basically marked for life. In the 1950s, elite Tutsis became impatient to gain independence. Due to this, the Belgians shifted their support from the Tutsis to the Hutus because they thought that the Hutus would be easier to control. After the king of Rwanda died in 1959, violence broke out in which the Hutus burnt down Tutsi houses and killed an estimated 10,000 to 100,000 Tutsis without any intervention from the Belgians. Each group felt that they were better than the other. By labeling one ethnicity as superior to the other, the two groups always had a bitter rivalry and conflict which divided them. Major General Juvenal Habyarimana took control over Rwanda in July 1973 in a coup. He became president, and under Habyarimana's control, Tutsis were still discriminated against. Though he had pledged to end all ethnic massacres, Habyarimana gave power and wealth to Hutus rather than distributing it equally. In addition to this, Habyarimana was a dictator who was a truly totalitarian party. He arrested 10,000 of his political opponents and made the Rwandan army grow by tenfold with the aid of France, who supplied weapons. His party was also the largest in the government, and he was able to cling on to power until his death. Outside of Rwanda, there was another force stirring. 1988 marked the formation of the RPF. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, was organized in Kampala, Uganda. It comprised mostly of Tutsis. There were some Hutus as well, but Tutsis filled all the leadership roles. The goals of the RPF was securing repatriation of Rwandans in exile and reforming of the Rwandan government, including political power sharing. Habyarimana didn't allow Tutsi refugees and exiles to return to Rwanda, which further increased tensions and conflict along the border. As a result, the public started a democratic movement which demanded more rights and fair elections. Habyarimana said he would agree to some government reform. However, the RPF invaded Rwanda in 1990, and the public's attention was drawn towards civil defense rather than political reform. When the RPF invaded Rwanda, there was a civil war which ensued between the two ethnic groups to gain or maintain power in Rwanda. After this violent clash, both parties wanted to end the conflict peacefully. Thus began the negotiations of the Arusha Accords. The Arusha Accords peace agreement officially began in July 1992. Both sides, Habyarimana and the RPF, knew that the militaries would need to be integrated together for there to be peace, and power would have to be shared. There were many disagreements about the size of the military, the ratio of RPF and forward government soldiers in the new military, how exactly the integration would take place, and how former troops would be reintegrated into the society when the country was not developing very well and there weren't enough jobs available. The international force had to help in facilitating the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program, along with providing funding for the programs to happen. Unfortunately, the international community was unable to gather funds, and Rwanda's government never went into a transitional state despite both parties signing the treaty. In August 1993, the Arusha Accords Treaty was finally signed, although there was a lot of distrust between the signatories and not enough funding for the programs. In 1994, the peace treaty was already failing. Demobilization wasn't happening. Rather, political parties were training the military and giving out weapons to civilians. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shut down. Within an hour, the genocide had begun. The Presidential Guard started their killing spree, starting with the Hutu Prime Minister and moving on to moderate Hutus, whose names were written on prepared lists. The militia also killed any Tutsis they could find. Then the RPF announced that they were breaking the ceasefire because they wanted to stop the killings. It was soon obvious that the outbreak of violence was not exactly caused by the plane crash. The Hutu leaders had methodically created lists of Tutsis to be killed by relying on the identification cards which each citizen had to have. An interim government was set up by the extremists who were dedicated to the genocides. Besides promoting a ceasefire, the international community did nothing other than pull their citizens out of Rwanda. Throughout the genocide, France was still in support of the Habyarimana regime. French troops were sent to the southwest of Rwanda to carve out a safety zone which the Hutus still controlled. This was called Operation Turquoise. The genocide organizers wanted to escape to Zaire and bring as many Rwandan Hutus as possible so that the RPF wouldn't have a functioning society and there would be millions of refugees. The killers would be able to hide within these masses. In addition, they wanted to rebuild military force to overthrow the RPF government. This was what the two Congo Wars were essentially about. After the genocide and civil war, a new constitution was written and implemented in 2003. This constitution aimed for national unity, which refers to division between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Rwanda's first multi-party democratic elections were held in 2003, which Paul Kagame won with 95% of the votes and the RPF won with the most seats in the parliament. As a result of the new government, many changes happened. The most important one was that there was strong patriotism in the country, and the people were more united, despite the Tutsis and Hutus being integrated together. The identity cards were also not used. Was the civil war and genocide in Rwanda justified? No, it wasn't. No genocide is ever justifiable. There is no justification for the deaths of more than 800,000 innocent people. The Germans and Belgians should never have raised tensions between the Tutsis and Hutus. By favoring one ethnicity over the other, there was great disparity between the groups. Though foreign intervention was what the civil war and genocide had stemmed from, foreign intervention could have prevented them from happening. France was the interim government supporter. The only time they intervened during the genocide was to prevent the militia from massacring people in a hotel in Kigali. However, France's Operation Turquoise was not the way to go to solve the genocide issue. The refugee camps which sprang up as a result of the operation were plagued with cholera, and the international community readily donated supplies to Hutus, even though it's not completely certain that they were used for helping the refugees. Barely any funding was given to the RPF, who truly needed it. And that is the Rwandan Civil War and Genocide summed up.